Wyoming Territory, 1885. The wind was a constant companion in this part of the world, a restless spirit that whispered through the sparse pines and scoured the dust from the hard-packed earth. Caleb Sterling felt it as a familiar pressure against his back as he mended a stretch of fence line, the wire biting into his leather gloves. For 5 years, this wind had been his most faithful conversationalist, its ceaseless murmuring a replacement for the sounds of a life he had buried alongside his wife, Sarah, and their boy, Thomas. The silence they left behind was a canyon inside him, and the wind only served to echo its vast emptiness. His world was one of order, of routine born from necessity and cemented by grief. He rose before the sun painted the eastern peaks in hues of rose and lavender, his first thoughts on the cattle, the water levels, the integrity of his fences. The ranch was a living thing that demanded his full attention, and he gave it willingly, for in the sweat and ache of honest labor, there was no room for memory's ghosts to take hold. His solitude was a fortress he had built stick by stick, stone by stone, its walls high and its gate barred. He had convinced himself it was not a prison, but a sanctuary. A man survived alone. That was the first and last lesson the unforgiving land had taught him. Attachments were anchors that could drag a man down into the depths. He finished twisting the last strand of wire, the metal groaning in protest. He straightened, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. His gaze swept over the rolling expanse of his land, the golden grasses bending in supplication to the wind, the distant mountains a jagged, purple wound against the sky. This was his kingdom, a lonely dominion of dust and sky, and he was its solitary king. He had everything a man could need and nothing a man could want. The thought came unbidden, sharp as a shard of glass, and he grunted, pushing it away. One was a weakness. Hope was a fool's currency. It was then that he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the natural rhythm of his world. Faint at first, then growing clearer, a long, mournful cry that sliced through the wind's whisper. The train whistle. It blew twice more, a signal of its approach to Hope's Crossing, the dusty collection of buildings that passed for a town some 5 miles distant. The 315 from Cheyenne. It was an intrusion, a mechanical serpent of smoke and steel that brought the outside world too close. It carried strangers with strange ideas, people who did not understand the quiet brutality and stark beauty of this place. Caleb turned his back to the sound, as if the physical act could deny its existence. But the whistle lingered in the air, a harbinger of disruption to the ordered silence he had so carefully constructed. He did not know why, but a cold knot of apprehension tightened in his gut, a feeling as unwelcome and foreign as the train itself. Alara Bishop stepped down from the train car, her hand clutching the polished handle of her valise. The hem of her fine wool traveling dress, the color of a summer sky, immediately collected a fine layer of amber dust. She blinked against the stark, unfiltered sunlight, a world away from the hazy, cold-dusted skies of Boston. The air here was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and something else, something wild and clean that filled her lungs and made her feel strangely lightheaded. Hope's Crossing was not so much a town as a suggestion, a single main street flanked by a dozen or so unpainted wooden buildings that looked as if they had grown directly from the parched earth. A wave of weariness washed over her, the culmination of 4 days spent rattling across the continent. Yet beneath the fatigue, a fragile tendril of hope unfurled in her chest. She scanned the small crowd on the platform. A few weathered cowboys, a woman with 2 small children, the station master with his drooping mustache, searching for the face of Mr. Jonathan Pike. His letters had been her lifeline for the past 6 months, their pages filled with eloquent descriptions of the growing community and its desperate need for a schoolteacher. He had written of a new schoolhouse, of eager children, and of a small, respectable cottage prepared just for her. His final letter had contained a proposal of marriage, a practical arrangement, he had assured her, that would grant her security and him a respectable partner. For Alara, an orphan with no prospects and dwindling funds, It had felt like Providence. But Mr. Pike was not there. She waited as the crowd dispersed, the steam from the engine hissing and then fading, leaving behind a profound quiet broken only by the creak of a distant wagon wheel. The station master was rolling a heavy crate toward the depot. She approached him, her voice feeling small in the vast open space. "Excuse me, sir. I am looking for Mr. Jonathan Pike. I was told he would be here to meet me." The man, whose nameplate read Hank, stopped and pushed his hat back on his balding head. He chewed on a toothpick, his eyes giving her a slow, assessing glance. "Pike, you say? Jonathan Pike?" He shook his head. "Ain't no one by that name in Hope's Crossing, miss. Lived here 15 years. Know every soul in a 50-mile radius. Never heard of him." The hope in Alara's chest withered and died, replaced by a cold, sharp dread that felt like swallowing ice. "But that cannot be. He wrote to me. He has a position for me. A house." Her voice trembled, betraying the composure she fought so hard to maintain. The letters, his promises, the ticket he had sent. It was all she had left in the world. Hank's expression softened with a flicker of pity. "Afraid you've been had, miss. There's no new schoolhouse, neither. Old one's been boarded up for 2 years since the last teacher ran off with a silver prospector. As for a cottage, well, there's the boarding house and the hotel over the saloon. That's about it." He gestured vaguely down the dusty street. "Sorry, miss. Looks like someone played a cruel trick on you," from the doorway of the mercantile across the street. Caleb watched the exchange. He had come to town for salt and coffee, a simple errand, but he had stopped when he saw her. She was a splash of impossible color against the dun landscape, like a wildflower blooming out of season. He had seen her hope, the eager way she scanned the platform, and he had seen it curdle into confusion and then stark fear. He knew that look. It was the look of someone whose world had just been pulled out from under them, leaving them standing on the edge of a precipice. He recognized the station master's sympathetic shrug, the woman's stiffening spine as she absorbed the blow. It was none of his business. He had his own fences to mend, his own ghost to keep at bay. He turned to go into the store, but he could not. Something in her posture, the way she clutched her bag as if it were the last solid thing in a dissolving world, held him fast. He remembered another woman, another train platform, another lifetime. Sarah, arriving with that same hopeful, determined light in her eyes, a light he had failed to protect from the harsh realities of this land. He shook his head, a sharp, angry motion to dislodge the memory. This was not Sarah. This was a stranger's problem. Yet his feet remained planted on the wooden boardwalk, his gaze fixed on the solitary figure in the blue dress. Alara felt the world tilt. Every promise, every carefully penned word, had been a lie. She was alone, thousands of miles from anything she knew, with less than $10 to her name. The vast, indifferent landscape seemed to press in on her, the sky too big, the silence too loud. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her composure. She took a deep, shaky breath, forcing the feeling down. Her father had always told her that a bishop did not crumble. She would not crumble. She would think. There had to be a solution. She picked up her heaviest trunk, the one containing her books and her parents' portraits, and tried to lift it. The weight was immense, and it barely budged. Tears of frustration and helplessness burned at the back of her eyes. She would not cry. Not here, in the middle of this dusty street, under the pitying gaze of strangers. She tried again, her fingers straining, the handle digging in her palm. "Let me help you with that." The voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. It came from directly behind her. She jumped, startled, and spun around, her heel catching on an uneven board. She stumbled backward, a small cry escaping her lips as she lost her balance. Strong hands caught her, one gripping her arm, the other settling firmly on the small of her back, steadying her against a hard, solid chest. The world stopped tilting. For a moment, all she was aware of was the sheer size and warmth of the man holding her. He smelled of leather, clean sweat, and the pine-scented air. Caleb looked down at the woman in his arms. Her hair, the color of spun honey, had come loose from its pins and curled softly around a face that was pale with shock. Her eyes, wide and startled, with the color of moss after a rain. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his hand. An unexpected jolt, something akin to a lightning strike on a clear day, shot through him. It was a feeling so foreign, so long forgotten, that it took his breath away. He had not stood this close to another person, had not offered or accepted comfort in 5 long years. The contact was a brand, searing through the layers of his carefully constructed solitude. He released her as if he had been burned, taking a half step back. "Apologies, ma'am," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Didn't mean to startle you." Elara gathered her composure, smoothing down the front of her dress, her cheeks flushed with color. The brief, shocking intimacy of the moment lingered in the air between them. "No, it was my fault." "Thank you." She looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He was taller than she had realized, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his chambray shirt. His face was all harsh angles and sun-weathered lines, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky. There was a deep-seated weariness in them, a guarded stillness that made him seem older than the 30-odd years she guessed him to be. He looked like the land itself, unforgiving, stark, and possessed of a severe, undeniable beauty. "You look like you needed a hand with your trunk," he stated, his gaze falling to the heavy luggage. It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of question or flourish. "Yes, I was just moving it off the platform." She gestured vaguely toward the town. "I need to find a place to stay." The station master mentioned a boarding house. Caleb's eyes flickered toward the street. He knew the boarding house. It was run by a nosy widow who rented rooms by the week, mostly to itinerant farmhands and the occasional gambler. It was no place for a woman like her, a woman who looked as delicate and out of place as a porcelain doll in a blacksmith shop. The thought irritated him. Her fragility was not his concern. And yet, the image of her standing alone, prey to the lies that had brought her here, stirred something protective in him he had thought long dead. "The boarding house is full up," he said, the lie coming easily to his lips. Mining survey crew took all the rooms. He hoisted her heavy trunk with an ease that made her blush, the muscles in his forearms cording. "Sheriff's office is this way." Brody might know of something. He did not wait for her reply, simply started walking, his long strides forcing her to hurry to keep pace. He was not offering a choice, merely stating a course of action. It was both infuriating and, to her surprise, deeply comforting. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt as if she was not entirely adrift. Sheriff Brody was a man whose considerable bulk seemed to have been poured into his chair behind a desk cluttered with wanted posters and dusty legal papers. He listened to Alara's story with a patient, sympathetic expression, his brow furrowed. Caleb stood by the door, arms crossed over his chest, his presence a silent, looming shadow. He felt like a man who had wandered into the wrong play, compelled by an instinct he did not understand to see the act through. "A cruel business, Miss Bishop," the sheriff said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "We get few of these schemes, luring folks out here with false promises. Usually it's men, promised land or gold. Never seen him target a lady before," he sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Hank was right, though. The boarding house is full, and the hotel, well, it's not a place for a respectable woman. The last of Alara's carefully constructed composure began to fray. "But surely there is somewhere, a family who might take me in? I can work. I can cook, clean. I can teach their children." Her voice was laced with a desperation she could no longer hide. Sheriff Brody shook his head regretfully. "Folks around here are private. Not many have a spare room, and fewer still are inclined to take in a stranger." He looked from Alara's distressed face to Caleb's implacable one. An idea seemed to dawn in his eyes. "Caleb, you've got room enough for an army out of your place. And Martha is there. It would all be perfectly proper." Caleb stiffened, his jaw tightening. His ranch was his sanctuary, the one place the outside world could not touch. The thought of bringing this woman, this embodiment of everything fragile and complicated he had sworn off, into his home was unthinkable. "No," he said, the word flat and final. "It's not possible. Why not?" Brody pressed, his gaze knowing. "Martha's been complaining for years about you being cooped up out there alone. Says the silence is loud enough to break glass. A little company might do you good. It's just until we can get her on the stage back to Cheyenne." "I am not a charity case, Sheriff," Alara interjected, her pride stung. She stood straighter, her chin lifting. "And I have no intention of imposing where I am not wanted. I will find my own way." Her flash of spirit took Caleb by surprise. He had mistaken her refinement for weakness. He saw now the steel beneath the silk. It was the same stubborn pride he saw in himself. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a problem to be solved, but a person cornered. The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane, and in that moment, leaving her to its mercy felt like a sin he was not willing to commit. He thought of his housekeeper, Martha, a kind but firm woman who had been his mother's friend and his own steadfast anchor since Sarah's death. Brody was right. Martha would not stand for him turning this woman away. And perhaps a small, treacherous part of him admitted he would not stand for it either. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of surrender. "My wagon's outside," he said, his voice still rough, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "It'll be dark soon." He turned and walked out of the office without another word, the unspoken invitation hanging in the air. Alara looked at the sheriff, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. With a deep breath that felt like both a leap of faith and a fall from a great height, she followed him out into the fading light. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a taut silence. Alara sat stiffly on the wagon bench, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of the man beside her. The sheer physical space he occupied seemed to generate its own gravity, pulling the air and the silence toward him. He handled the team of horses with an easy, competent grace, his large hands gentle on the reins. The landscape unfolded around them, a breathtaking tapestry of purple shadows and fiery orange light as the sun bled into the horizon. It was a beauty so vast and untamed it was almost violent, and it made her feel smaller and more insignificant than ever before. Caleb felt her presence like a stone in his shoe, a constant, irritating awareness. He could feel her watching him, could sense her unspoken questions. He kept his eyes on the trail, his thoughts churning. He was breaking his own first rule, keep to yourself. He was inviting chaos into his ordered world. But the image of her face when the sheriff had told her there was nowhere to go, it had mirrored a desolation he knew intimately. He was not a cruel man, merely a broken one. And sometimes, the pieces of a broken thing could not help but recognize their own jagged edges in another. They arrived at the ranch as the last light faded from the sky. The house was a sturdy, two-story structure made of dark timber, with a wide porch and windows that glowed with a warm, welcoming light. It was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of tall cottonwoods. A woman, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with a no-nonsense set to her mouth, came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. This was Martha. "Caleb, you're late for supper," she called out, her voice carrying easily on the still evening air. Then she saw Alara. Her eyes widened slightly, taking in a stranger's fine dress and weary, dust-streaked face. She looked at Caleb, one eyebrow raised in a silent, demanding question. "She needs a place to stay for a few days," Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. His tone was clipped, offering no further explanation. "She can take the spare room." Martha looked from Caleb's shuttered expression to Alara's exhausted one. A flicker of understanding and something like satisfaction crossed her features. She came down the steps, her stern face softening. "Well, don't just stand there in the cold. Come inside, child. You look half frozen and starved." Supper's on the stove. She took one of Alara's bags from Caleb's hand and ushered the younger woman toward the house, leaving Caleb to unload the rest of the luggage in the sudden, profound silence of her absence. He watched them go, the warm light from the doorway spilling out to welcome her in. For a moment, it looked like a home again. The thought was so painful he slammed the wagon's tailgate shut with more force than necessary. The days that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Alara, determined not to be a burden, insisted on helping Martha with the household chores. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands struggling with the stiff dough. She learned to pluck a chicken, her stomach churning at the unfamiliar task. She learned the particular way Caleb liked his coffee, black, hot, and strong enough to dissolve a spoon. In the evenings, the three of them would sit in the main room, the air thick with the scent of pine from the fire and the unspoken thoughts that hung between them. Martha would knit, her needles clicking a steady, comforting rhythm. Caleb would sit in his worn leather armchair, cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of tack, his focus absolute, his silence a wall. Alara found herself watching him. She watched the way his hands, though calloused and scarred, moved with a surprising delicacy as he worked oil into a leather strap. She watched the way the firelight caught the silver threads at his temples and carved deep shadows into the harsh planes of his face. She saw the profound loneliness that clung to him like a shroud, a loneliness so deep it seemed a part of his very being. She felt a kinship with it, a pull toward the quiet sorrow in his gray eyes. But his wall was impenetrable. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words practical and brief, never inviting conversation. One evening, a week after her arrival, she found him on the porch, staring out at the star-dusted sky. The moon was a perfect silver coin, bathing the landscape in an ethereal glow. She had been unable to sleep, her mind a whirl of uncertainty. The stage to Cheyenne was due in 2 days, and she still had no plan, no destination. She hesitated in the doorway, not wanting to intrude on his solitude. "You should be inside," he said without turning. "The temperature drops fast out here. I'm not cold," she lied, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stepped out onto the porch and stood near the railing, a few feet away from him. The silence stretched between them, more comfortable than the strained quiet of the house. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I've never seen so many stars," he grunted in what might have been agreement. He had seen this sky every night for 5 years, but he had stopped noticing its beauty. Tonight, through her eyes, it seemed new again. "You miss it, don't you?" she asked, her question so unexpected it caught him off guard. He finally turned to look at her. In the moonlight, her face was soft and serious, her eyes searching his. "Miss what?" "The East," she clarified. "The cities. People. The life you left behind." A humorless smile touched his lips. "This is the only life I've ever known. I was born in a sod house not 20 miles from here. This land is in my bones." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the dark horizon. "What about you? You must be eager to get back to your world of books and cobblestone streets." The question was a gentle probe, but pierced her heart. "I don't have a world to go back to," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion she could no longer suppress. "My parents died last winter in the influenza epidemic. They were all I had. The man who wrote to me, he was my only hope. I sold everything I owned for the ticket and to have a little to start a new life." A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. He was silent for a long time, absorbing her words. He had assumed she was running to something, not from the utter devastation of having nothing. He understood that kind of emptiness. He knew its weight, its cold, its suffocating power. He felt an unwelcome crack appear in the wall around his heart. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate and rusty from disuse. He took a hesitant step closer. "I lost my wife and son 5 years ago. Fever took them both in less than a week." The confession hung in the cold night air, a raw, unguarded thing. He had not spoken of them to anyone but Martha in all that time. He did not know why he had told her, this stranger, this woman who was the antithesis of everything his life had become. But in her quiet grief, he had seen a reflection of his own, and the shared vulnerability was a bond he had not anticipated. Alara looked at him, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten in the face of his. Now she understood the source of the profound sadness in his eyes, the reason for his self-imposed exile from the world. It was not bitterness that fueled his solitude, but a grief so immense he had to build a fortress to contain it. "I am so very sorry, Caleb," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. He gave a curt nod, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He had shared his deepest wound, and the world had not ended. The canyon inside him did not feel quite so empty. In the shared darkness, a fragile bridge of understanding had been built between them, a connection forged in the crucible of loss. It was terrifying, and it was the first thing that had made him feel truly alive in 5 years. The next morning, Elara rose with a new sense of purpose. The stagecoach was leaving tomorrow, and the thought of returning to the east, to a world that held nothing for her, was unbearable. She had discovered a small, neglected plot behind the house where Martha had once tried to grow herbs. Armed with a rusty trowel and a fierce determination, she set about clearing the weeds. If she could make something grow in this harsh, unforgiving soil, then perhaps she, too, could put down roots. It was a foolish, symbolic gesture, but it was hers. Caleb saw her from the barn, her back bent to the task, the honey-colored strands of her hair escaping her bun and catching the morning sun like threads of gold. He watched as she worked, her movements surprisingly efficient, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was not the delicate porcelain doll he had first imagined. There was a strength in her, a quiet resilience that he had not expected. She was not trying to tame the land, but to coexist with it, to coax life from it. A reluctant admiration bloomed in his chest. Later that day, he rode into Hope's Crossing for supplies. As he was leaving the mercantile, he saw 2 men emerge from the saloon. They were not locals. They were dressed too finely, their boots too clean, their faces bearing the pale, indoor complexion of city men. They carried themselves with an arrogant swagger that set Caleb's teeth on edge. As he watched, they approached Sheriff Brody, who was standing on the boardwalk. Caleb was too far away to hear their words, but he saw the sheriff shake his head and point in the direction of his ranch. The men nodded, a shared look of smug satisfaction passing between them, before they mounted their horses and rode out of town. A cold unease settled over Caleb. It was one thing for a woman to be the victim of a cruel romantic deception. It was another entirely for men like that to be looking for her. These were not the kind of men who played simple tricks. He urged his horse into a faster pace, the dust rising in a plume behind him. The sanctuary he had built suddenly felt terribly vulnerable. When he arrived back at the ranch, he found Elara in the kitchen, humming softly as she helped Martha peel potatoes. The scene was so domestic, so peaceful, that it felt like a punch to the gut. It was a life he had once had, a life he had sworn he would never risk again. "We need to talk," he said, his voice grim. He directed the words to Elara. Martha looked between them, her expression concerned, but she quietly gathered her peelings and left the room, giving them privacy. "What is it?" Elara asked, her smile fading at his tone. "There were 2 men in town," he began, his voice low. "Strangers. They were asking about a woman who arrived on the 3:15 a week ago. A woman from Boston." He watched her face, saw the flicker of confusion give way to alarm. "The deception that brought you here, I don't think it was just a prank. I think it was deliberate. I think someone wanted you out of the way." Elara sank onto a nearby stool, her hands trembling. "But why? I have nothing. No family, no money. Who will want me out of the way? I don't know. But men like that don't get involved for no reason." He thought of the letter she had shown him, the one signed by the fictitious Jonathan Pike. The paper had been expensive, the handwriting elegant. It had promised her a life here, tied her to this specific place. "Did your parents leave anything? An inheritance? Property?" She shook her head, bewildered. "My father was a professor. We lived comfortably, but we were not wealthy. There was only the house, and I sold it to pay his debts." She paused, her mind racing. "There was one thing, a small parcel of land in Pennsylvania. My grandfather bought it years ago, thinking there might be coal, but the surveys were all negative. It was deemed worthless. My father's lawyer is managing it, but he said it was nothing more than a tax burden." A piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Caleb. Maybe it's not worthless anymore, he said grimly. Maybe a new survey found something. A railroad coming through, a new seam of coal. If you were declared missing or dead, whoever stands to inherit after you. My father had a cousin, she whispered, her face pale. Amos. He always resented my father's success. He would be the next of kin, the name of the lawyer who had advised her to accept the teaching position and sell her father's belongings so quickly suddenly came to mind. He had been a new associate, recommended by Amos himself. The pieces were falling into a sickening pattern. She had not been the victim of a random, cruel trick, but of a cold, calculated plot to steal her inheritance and dispose of her. The world reeled around her, and she gripped the edge of the table for support. Caleb's hand covered hers, his touch surprisingly gentle, his warmth a steadying anchor in the sudden storm of her fear. You're safe here, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a promise, but a statement of fact, a vow. In that moment, his fortress of solitude expanded just enough to include her within its walls. He was no longer just protecting a stranger. He was defending one of his own. The next few days were fraught with a new tension. The vast, open spaces that had once seemed beautiful to Alara now felt menacing, exposing. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. Caleb became a silent, watchful sentinel. He spent less time on the far fences and more time near the house, his rifle never far from his hand. He taught Alara how to load and fire the small shotgun Martha kept by the hearth, his hands brushing hers as he showed her how to handle the weapon, sending an electric current through her that had nothing to do with fear. The forced proximity and shared danger began to erode the careful distance between them. They spoke more, their conversations moving from practical matters to cautious explorations of their pasts. He told her about building the ranch with his father, about the satisfaction of seeing a calf take its first wobbly steps. She told him about Boston, about the libraries and museums, about her dream of one day opening a school that taught girls not just needlepoint but science and literature. He listened, his gray eyes intent, and for the first time, she felt truly seen. She was not just a problem to be solved or a woman to be protected. She was Alara, a person with dreams and a history. One afternoon, the threat moved from a shadow on the horizon to a physical reality. Alara had taken a bucket to the well near the barn when two riders appeared at the end of the long drive. It was the men Caleb had described. They rode slowly, their eyes scanning the property with an unnerving confidence. One of them, a man with a cruel twist to his mouth, dismounted and started walking toward her. "Well now, what do we have here?" he said, his voice slick with false charm. "You must be the little schoolteacher we've been looking for. You're a long way from home." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, her hand tightening on the wooden bucket handle. "I don't know who you are. This is private property. You should leave," the man chuckled. "We're just here to deliver a message for your cousin Amos. He's very concerned about you. He wants you to come home." He took another step closer, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "He sent us to escort you." Before she could reply, the heavy oak door of the barn slid open with a groan. Caleb stood in the shadowed opening, a pitchfork held loosely in one hand. He did not look threatening, but his stillness was more menacing than any overt display of aggression. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The second rider, still mounted, shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "This ain't your concern, rancher. This is family business. She's on my land," Caleb countered, taking a slow step out of the barn and into the sunlight. "That makes it my concern." He flicked his gaze to the man near Alara. "You've got 10 seconds to get back on your horse and ride out of here," the man sneered. "Or what? You gonna stick me with your farming tool?" He took another step toward Alara, reaching for her arm. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Caleb crossed the distance between them. He did not use the pitchfork. He dropped it, and his fist connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The rider drew his pistol, but Caleb was already moving, grabbing the bridle of the horse and yanking down hard. The animal reared, screaming in panic. and the rider tumbled from the saddle. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him, his pistol flying into the dust. Caleb stood over the gasping man, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a cold fire Alara had never seen before. "Get him on his horse," he snarled, "and get off my land. If I see either of you again, I will not be so courteous." The man scrambled to his feet, terror in his eyes. He dragged his unconscious partner onto his horse, mounted his own, and galloped away without a backward glance. The dust settled, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Alara stared at Caleb, her breath caught in her throat. She had seen his quiet strength, his competence, but she had never witnessed this raw, violent capacity for protection. He had not hesitated. He had moved to defend her, as if it were the most natural instinct in the world. He turned to her, the fire in his eyes banking, replaced by a deep, simmering anger. But it was not directed at her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She could only nod, her words failing her. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a smudge of dust from her cheek. The brief touch was an earthquake. It shattered the last of her defenses and his. In that moment, standing in the harsh sunlight amidst the aftermath of violence, the truth of what was growing between them was laid bare. It was more than gratitude, more than respect. It was something fierce and terrifying and utterly undeniable. He dropped his hand as if her skin had burned him, his expression closing down, the walls slamming back into place. "Stay in the house," he ordered, his voice once again clipped and distant. "They'll be back, and they'll come ready for a fight." He turned and walked back toward the barn, his broad back a rigid line of resolve, leaving her trembling in the sudden, lonely quiet. That night, the ranch was a fortress under siege. Caleb boarded the lower windows, his movements economical and grim. He checked his rifle and his pistol, laying out boxes of cartridges on the heavy oak table in the main room. Martha, her face a stoic mask, moved through the house, her quiet competence a calming presence. She brought them a cold supper of bread and cheese, knowing the stove would be a dangerous beacon in the dark. Alara felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. This was her home now. These people, the stoic, grieving man and the stern, kind woman, were her family. She would not be a damsel in distress, cowering in a corner while man fought her battles. She picked up the shotgun Martha had shown her how to use, its weight solid and reassuring in her hands. Caleb saw the determination in her eyes and did not argue. He had spent the afternoon pushing her away, trying to rebuild the walls they had breached. He had told himself it was to protect her, that if he kept his distance, her departure would be easier. But it was a lie. He was protecting himself. He was terrified of the hope she represented, terrified of what he stood to lose if he let himself feel again. Watching her stand there, ready to face whatever was coming, he knew it was too late. She was already a part of him, woven into the fabric of his broken life. Losing her now would be an amputation. He found her in the hayloft an hour later. She had climbed the ladder to look out the high window, which offered a clear view of the long drive. The loft was filled with the sweet, dry scent of hay, and slivers of moonlight cut through the gaps in the timbers, striping the air with silver. She stood silhouetted against the window, the shotgun held loosely at her side. "You should be downstairs," he said, his voice soft in the quiet space. "I wanted to watch," she replied, not turning. "I feel less helpless if I can see." He came to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching in the narrow space. For a long time, they stood in silence, two sentinels watching the dark, empty land. The air between them was electric, thick with everything they had not said. The fear of the coming fight mingled with a deeper, more profound fear of the feelings that had taken root between them. "Caleb," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "after this is over, you want me to leave." "I know you do," his silence was her answer. He was going to send her away, back to a world where she would be safe. It was the right thing to do, the honorable thing. It was the only way to protect her from the violence that clung to him, from the ghosts that haunted his life. It was a lie, and it tasted like ash in his mouth. She finally turned to face him, her eyes luminous in the dim light. "I don't want to go," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This place, it feels more like home than anywhere I have ever been." Her words were a hammer blow to the last of his defenses. He could see the truth of them shining in her face, a truth that mirrored the one hidden in the deepest corner of his own heart. He fought the tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. He had to be strong. He had to protect her, even from himself. "You don't belong here, Elara," he said, his voice rough with unshed pain. "This is no life for you. It's hard and it's dangerous. I can't. I won't be responsible for putting that light in your eyes out. You think I am that fragile?" she challenged, her voice rising with passion. "You think I am some delicate flower that will wilt in the sun? I have lost everything, Caleb. I have faced down liars and thieves. I'm still standing. You don't get to decide what I can and cannot endure." She took a step closer, her hand rising to touch his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its frantic, heavy beat. "This is my choice." He looked down at her hand, then up into her searching eyes. He saw no fear there, only a fierce, unwavering certainty. Everything he had believed about himself, about the necessity of his solitude, shattered like glass against stone. She was not a weakness. She was his strength. He covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "Elara," he breathed, his voice breaking. He had to know. He had to be sure. He lifted his other hand to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. Her skin was so soft. "Look at me," he commanded gently. She met his gaze, her own eyes wide and shimmering. "Tell me you don't feel it too." She did not have to speak. The answer was in the tear that slipped from her eye, in the soft sigh that escaped her lips. It was in the way she leaned into his touch, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. "I feel it," she whispered, the words a sacred vow in the dusty, moonlit loft. "I have felt it since the moment you caught me on the train platform." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of fear and hope, of two lonely souls finding their harbor in a storm. It was the taste of 5 years of solitude being washed away by a flood of feelings so powerful it stole his breath. He poured all of his pain, all of his longing, all of his unspoken adoration into that kiss, and she met him with an equal fire, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. A shout from the darkness outside broke them apart. "Sterling, we know you're in there. Send out the girl, and we'll let you live." The voice belonged to Silas Blackwood. Caleb recognized it instantly. Blackwood was a ruthless cattle baron who had been trying to force Caleb out for years, hungry for his land and its access to the river. The deception, the men, Elara, it had all been part of Blackwood's scheme. He must have intercepted Amos's plan, using it to create a pretext to come after Caleb's ranch. Caleb pulled away from Elara, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He pressed the rifle into her hands. "Stay here. Stay away from the window. Bar the ladder behind me. Do not come down unless I call for you. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but her hands steady on the weapon. He gave her one last, hard look, a look that said everything he could not, and then he was gone, slipping down the ladder and into the darkness of the barn below. She heard the heavy bars slide into place, sealing her in the relative safety of the loft. The night erupted into chaos. Gunshots shattered the quiet, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the hills. From her vantage point, Elara could see flashes of light from the trees at the edge of the property. She saw Caleb, a fleeting shadow moving between the house and the barn, firing with a deadly, methodical precision. He was one man against at least 4, but he moved with the confidence of someone defending his entire world. A bullet splintered the wood of the window frame near her head, and she dropped to the floor, her heart pounding. She crawled to the back of the loft, pressing herself against the rough-hewn timbers. She felt a terrifying helplessness, trapped while the man she loved fought for their lives below. But Caleb had taught her to be more than helpless. She remembered his instructions, the feel of the shotgun in her hands. She would not cower. One of Blackwood's men managed to break away from the main fight and sneak around to the side of the house. She heard the sickening crunch of glass as he smashed a kitchen window. Martha screamed, a short, sharp cry of terror. Without a second thought, Alara scrambled back to the front window. She could see the man climbing through the broken pane. Caleb was pinned down behind the water trough, unable to get a clear shot. "No," she whispered, her voice fierce. She raised a shotgun, resting the heavy barrel on the windowsill. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was iron. She sighted down the barrel, just as Caleb had shown her, leading her target slightly. She took a deep breath, held it, and pulled the trigger. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder with a deafening roar, the force of it knocking her backward. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. She scrambled back to the window in time to see the man stagger back out of the house, his arm a bloody mess, screaming in pain and surprise before collapsing in the yard. The shot created the diversion Caleb needed. He broke from cover, his rifle blazing, and took down another of the attackers. The tide had turned. The remaining two men, including Blackwood, realized their position was hopeless. They fired a few more wild shots before retreating into the darkness. Just as their hoofbeats faded into the distance, the sound of more riders approached, this time from the direction of town. It was Sheriff Brody and a posse, alerted by a ranch hand from a neighboring property who had heard the gunfire. The silence that descended was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of survival, of victory. Alara fumbled with the bar on the ladder and scrambled down into the barn. She ran out into the yard, her only thought of Caleb. She found him by the water trough, reloading his rifle, his face grim in the moonlight. He was alive. He was unharmed. She threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror and relief. "I thought," she sobbed, unable to finish the sentence. He held her tightly, his arms a circle of unshakable strength around her. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, reassuring himself that she was real, that she was safe. "You were magnificent," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved Martha. You saved us." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. The last of his walls had been utterly demolished, burned to the ground in the heat of the battle. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth. "I love you, Alara Bishop," he said, the words he had thought he would never speak again coming as easily as breathing. "I love your courage and your strength and the way you see the stars. I was a dead man walking before you came here. You brought me back to life." Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy this time. "I love you, Caleb Sterling," she answered, her voice choked with happiness. "And I'm not going anywhere." Sheriff Brody and his men took care of the aftermath, carting away Blackwood's wounded man and setting out after the Baron himself, who was captured before he reached the county line. The external threat had been neutralized, the plot unraveled. Justice would be served. But for Caleb and Alara, the true resolution had already occurred in the moonlit yard. The next morning, as the sun rose over a world that felt brand new, Caleb led Alara into the main room. Martha was there, her eyes red, but her smile genuine. She knew, without a word being spoken, that everything had changed. Caleb went to a small, locked wooden box on the mantelpiece. He opened it and took out a simple gold band, inset with a single, small pearl. "This was my grandmother's ring," he said, his voice quiet and steady. He turned to Alara, his gray eyes shining with a love that was fierce and unwavering. "She passed it to my mother, who gave it to me for Sarah." He paused, taking a deep breath. "It represents my past, my family, everything this land means to me. I thought I would have to bury it forever." He knelt on one knee before her, holding the ring up. "Alara, my future is nothing without you in it. Will you marry me? Will you build a new life with me here?" Alara's heart felt as if it would burst. She looked from the ring, a symbol of a past she would honor, to the face of the man who held her future in his hands. She saw not a wounded loner, but a whole and loving man who had fought his way back from the depths of grief. She saw her home. Yes, she breathed, tears of happiness blurring her vision. Oh yes, Caleb. Yes, he slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. Their wedding was a small affair, held on the porch of the ranch house 2 weeks later. The entire town of Hope's Crossing seemed to turn out. The community that had once seemed so private and unwelcoming now rallied around them. The men helped Caleb repair the damage from the fight, while the women brought gifts of food and handmade quilts. They had seen the strength of the bond between the solitary rancher and the refined lady from the East, and they had embraced it. Sheriff Brody stood as Caleb's best man, and Martha, weeping openly, stood beside Alara. As they said their vows, with the vast Wyoming sky as their witness, it felt not like an ending, but a true beginning. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the porch of the expanded ranch house. A climbing rose, planted by Alara, now snaked its way up the railings, its deep red blossoms a vibrant splash of color against the dark wood. The ranch was thriving, and so were its inhabitants. Caleb sat in a sturdy rocking chair he had built, his arm resting protectively around Alara's shoulders as she leaned against him. In his other arm, he held their son, a 1-year-old boy with his mother's honey-colored hair and his father's serious gray eyes. The child, named Daniel after Alara's father, gurgled happily, his small hand wrapped around Caleb's finger. Alara was expecting their second child, her belly a gentle, promising curve beneath her simple cotton dress. She rested her head on Caleb's shoulder, her heart full to bursting. The silence that surrounded them was no longer empty. It was filled with the hum of insects, the lowing of distant cattle, the soft breathing of her husband and child. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of home. Do you ever miss it? Caleb asked softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Boston? The life you might have had. Alara smiled, turning her face up to kiss his weathered jaw. She looked out at the rolling hills, painted in the soft, forgiving light of dusk. She thought of the woman who had stepped off the train 2 years ago, so full of false hopes and so utterly alone. She barely recognized her. That woman had been searching for a safe harbor, for a place to belong. She had found so much more. She had found a home in the heart of a man who had forgotten how to live, and in doing so, had found the truest version of herself. No, she said, her voice full of a deep and abiding certainty. Everything I could ever want is right here. Caleb tightened his hold on her and their son, his gaze meeting hers. The weariness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a love so profound it needed no words. He had once believed that a man survived alone, that attachments were a weakness. Now, holding his entire world in his arms, he knew the truth. Love was not an anchor that dragged you down. It was the only thing that could ever truly hold you up.